This is an off-topic question sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from John Fell in Baltimore.
Finally! What, has John been excommunicated? Has he been exiled? Has he had heat? Is there heat? I can feel it. It's not scalding, but it's there. Why have you not been providing folks with more questions from John Fell in Baltimore, who is the assistant deputy grand poobah of the Baltimore chapter of the Cult of Cornette?
I think he's been doing a smart babyface thing. You let Charlie from Starkville come in. He's not getting over as well as the previous babyface, and now he's returning to the territory. Could be that, but here's his question.
He went away and learned a new hold.
He's the assistant deputy. Who's the deputy?
I can't go into that. That high up, it's classified. There's certain things you have to do to get that high up. We can't go into detail.
I have a question about your comic book collection. In addition to Marvel and DC, did you also buy books from the other publishers like Charlton, Dell, and Gold Key? If so, what titles did you collect? And out of your collection, what is your most prized comic books?
Oh, God. Well, yeah, as you would expect, I got everything, especially if it was old. If I could find it at the flea market, it was old, I got everything. All the Gold Keys, the Charltons, the fucking Dells, when I could, the Dell was, especially those 50s Dells, because they were publishing 40s and 50s, they were publishing the Disney books. So those sometimes hard to find in high grade because all the kids wadded them up and stuck them in their back pockets. But I was a completist. When I was a kid, I thought, well, at some point, sometime, I'll have one of every comic book that's ever been printed. Because I was a fucking kid, and I've got the OCD even then. Now, it just wasn't diagnosed. Then I came to realize, well, that would not be possible even if I was Bill Gates. So I would have said, up until about 3 years ago, my most prized comic was my Amazing Fantasy 15. But as was publicized at the time, I sold that and turned that into my brand new front fence and stone columns. But that would have been my most prized book. Right now, actually, it wouldn't be considered a rare book, but probably my favorite one now, just because it's the first superhero book that I remember buying off the stands, would be Tales to Astonish 101, which was with the next issue, it became the Incredible Hulk, this 1968 series 102. But I believe that is the first Marvel superhero book that I bought off the stands, and I've still got it.
Were you ever into EC Comics or Mad Magazine, actually?
Well, I like Mad Magazine. As a matter of fact, I have about 2 or 3 boxes of Mad Magazines going back to the early 60s. But EC Comics, I was not, because those were the comic books that were too expensive and almost impossible to get when I was a kid. When you could buy at the time, because it still was the Silver Age, you could buy Silver Age Marvels for 50 cents and a fucking $1. And when I first started collecting, Fantastic Four #1, a good price for a average red copy was $15 or $20. I paid $25 for my Amazing Fantasy 15. Actually, my mother did in 1973 because it was a birthday present. And I got $25,000 for it 40 years later. But the EC Comics, because this was the late 60s, early 70s, they were from the early and mid 50s. The older people that had graduated college and gotten jobs and had a little money, but remembered them, plus the pre-comics code stuff and ECW. That weighed on Heyman's mind as well when he was naming it. But EC Comics was known as the people that went too far with the violence and the gore and the whatever. So they were more collectible and they cost a ton of money. And since there weren't any around anymore, I didn't collect them currently. So I wasn't going to just go on this back issue crusade, and I didn't have the money to spend anyway. So I got everything, but it was primarily Silver Age stuff and 50 stuff that I could get cheap at the flea market. And then I started picking up a few select Golden Age comics when I could and could get a deal on it, because they were still the same superheroes. Marvel had the Submariner and Human Torch and Captain America. And, DC had still had Superman and Batman and et cetera. So, every once in a while I would locate one of those. I had a coverless Wonder Woman #1 at one time. And I had Batman #16, which was the first appearance of Alfred, but half the cover was torn. Yeah, but half the cover was torn off. So, that's the only really nice Golden Age comic that I ever got and paid money for was, once again, it was a Christmas present again. And when I was like 13, World's Finest Comics, Superman and Batman.
Yeah.
The first issue was titled World's Best #1. And it was a 96-page comic with a hard or a flat spine. 1941 or 2, I believe. And my mom got it for Christmas for me. It was $100, as the most I ever paid for a comic book.
$100 when you were 13.
$100 when I was 13.
Wow.
Here's the mistake I made. In the late 90s, when I needed some Christmas money, Smoky Mountain, I took a few of my books that I had nothing else to go with. It wasn't breaking up a run or whatever. And one of them was World's Best #1, and I sold it at the time. That was 20 years later. I sold it for $1,200. But now it would be worth thousands and thousands and thousands. It was like about Tales of Suspense 39, the first Iron Man. I sold that in the early 2000s, right before the fucking first movie came out. It was a very fine copy. I got Overstreet Guide for it, which was $2,000. And now the Overstreet Guide, fucking 20 years later or whatever, not even 20 years later, is like fucking 12 or 14 grand. So I regretted those decisions.
Have you watched any of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies?
I love Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. They started making so many. I never have time to go to the movies. And if I do watch movies at home, it's generally old black and white movies. So I haven't watched everything and been up to date on all the Avengers and everything else. But I loved the initial Iron Man movies because I liked Robert Downey Jr. I thought he did a great job with it.
They're so good. And honestly, I hope you get caught up with the Avengers movies. The last 2 Avengers movies are 2 of the greatest movies ever. I know Martin Scorsese says they're not movies. You can't really consider it. They're so good and just they're done so well. The only thing that I regret is when you watch them, and if you grew up collecting comics or reading comics, it's like, what sucks? The X-Men aren't here, the Fantastic Four aren't here, the Submariner isn't here, Silver Surfer isn't here. There's lots of, they include as many as they can, but there's a lot of characters that you wish were a part of these films that...
Well, yeah, because their rights, they've still got their rights pieced out to different places, right? The Marvel characters, and it hasn't come together.
Well, the X-Men have come together because they bought 20th Century Fox. I'm not sure what the status of Fantastic Four or Submariner are, or Silver Surfer. Do you know what the first Marvel movie actually was?
The first one? I'm sure you're about to tell me.
Howard the Duck.
That's right.
Which was one of the worst movies of all time. But he makes a cameo in a few of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. Howard the Duck has short little cameos. My kids didn't know who he was. I had to explain that's Howard the Duck. He made a really awful movie in 1987 or whatever it was.
And the comic book was really awful in 1975?
Steve Gerber.
But hey, and here's the thing, I go back so long with comic book collecting. I can remember when Fantastic Four was the main event group and Spider-Man was the second in command. And then at some point in time that flip-flopped and Spidey became the guy, but Fantastic Four was the main event in the Marvel universe.
When you were a kid, and obviously things changed really with the relaunch of the X-Men with Wolverine and Colossus and, different people in the group now, Nightcrawler. But what were the X-Men considered when you were a kid? Did you think of them much, or were they kind of an afterthought?
Well, it kind of went Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and this is probably more just popularity of the book, but books, Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Hulk, Avengers, and then, the individual Avengers, and X-Men was kind of in the middle. And actually, when you go back and look, the comic only ran through issue 50 or 60, maybe 70 something, and then went into reruns, reprints for years because the sales, it wasn't there. And then suddenly with the introduction of the new X-Men with that annual #1, and what was the giant size #1, and then X-Men 94 was the new one, right? Anyway, they took off, but no, X-Men were at one point were canceled. They kept the title, they just did reprints. But so they weren't really the big deal. But I liked them because I liked the whole deal of Professor X in the wheelchair with the telepathic powers. And I liked the original X-Men. You got a guy with wings. You got a guy that fucking freezes shit. You got a guy with fucking laser vision. You got the Beast. He was their thing. But see, that's the thing. No pun intended. It was kind of like, well, we came up with a Fantastic Four, but there's 5 of them. Because think about it. They kind of had all the same. The Beast was the thing. The Angel could fly, and so could Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, but we had the guy with the X-ray vision instead of the guy with the fucking, or not the X-ray vision, but the laser vision, Cyclops, instead of Mr. Fantastic, who could stray. A lot of fucking similarities there. What did I just say? When you want to bring a main event talent in, don't have similarities to underneath talents.
I know you were on the road and actively doing so much throughout the 80s, but did you keep up at all with any of the big events like Secret Wars or The Watchmen, which was a big deal, obviously? And
absolutely nothing. Not a thing. I got away from comic books for like fucking 20 years. I still had them all and still have many of them. And then I started reading the Overstreet again, but I never started buying books again when I finally came back home here.
All right. Well, with that, we wrap up another episode of the Drive-Thru. Good question,
I'm only
John.
one man. I'm only one man. Good question, John. By the way, yes, it was. But I'm only one man, and I can't do everything and have every hobby in the world and be an expert in every field of endeavor. I can't be an expert in every single orifice.
Well, my goal is, once people stop sending you money, we can get you to watch Monster Squad and some of the Marvel Cinematic Universe films, and we could do some of those reviews on Patreon.
Well, there you go.
That'll be fun. I think you'll actually enjoy them too.